Hi, I'm Shawna.
And I'm Liz.
Welcome to Getting Bookish, a weekly podcast where we will talk about different book-related topics, let you know what we're reading, and even answer Q&As from you.
Be sure to visit our website, gettingbookish.com, and check us out on Facebook and Instagram at Getting Bookish. If you enjoy our podcast, we'd love for you to subscribe and leave us a rating and review, which helps us to be seen by other book lovers.
With all that said, we hope you'll enjoy Getting Bookish with us.
Enjoy the podcast.
Hey friends, I hope everybody's doing fantastic. I have kind of a funny story to share. Today I was at the bookstore working like I do on Saturdays, and it's always super fun. And this couple came in and they were browsing around, and the guy comes up to the counter and he asks the question. Not the will you marry me question, but the unanswerable question.
Oh no.
For a reader. I know.
Oh no.
He asks, what is your favorite book?
No.
And I know. And I stood there kind of, dumbfounded for a second.
Yeah.
And then he immediately is like, oh, I'm so sorry. You must not be a reader. I know. And I was like, nope, that's not it. Wait a second.
I know your brain is like firing on all cylinders trying to figure out the answer to this question. Meanwhile, he's just looking at you like, oh no, she's not a reader. I asked the wrong person.
Right. And I'm just like I couldn't even think through it in the moment. And I don't ever feel prepared for someone to ask me that.
Yeah.
But normally it's a child that's like, oh, what's your favorite book? Because they also ask each other what their favorite colors are. And
Right.
so, I didn't even know how to respond. And so I was just kind of like, oh, well, I don't really have a favorite book. And then he just looked at me like that was the weirdest thing ever. And they went about browsing. And so, do you have a favorite book?
Well, it's funny because as soon as you said that, I was picturing myself in that situation. And it's one of those where if somebody asks me if I have a favorite book, it's like all of a sudden I can't remember any books because
Right.
I have so many favorites that I can't even tell you one of them. And it's like my brain just dies because it's like just one. Because if you think of your brain as like these file cabinets, it's like shuffling through, like we don't have a tab for favorite book, There's
love
so
it.
many. But no, that's a tough question. That's the unanswerable question for a reader, for an avid reader.
Right. And when he asked me, after I was done being completely confused, I wanted to say, do you have a favorite book?
Right?
Because I'm curious about the type of person or the type of reader
Who has a favorite?
Has a favorite.
I feel
And so I was wondering, could he have a favorite book? Maybe he's only read a dozen books
exactly
in his life.
I was just going to say, maybe the only people that could possibly have a singular favorite book of their whole life, they can't have read more than 10 books.
Right.
They
I've
can't.
read, what am I at? I'm at 16 books since the beginning of the year. And, which nobody do the math on that because I'm way off my goal. But I was thinking, I don't even think I have a favorite book since January.
I was just going to say, because are you talking about a favorite book per genre? Are you talking about a favorite book that I've read this month? Or a favorite book, of all time? Because I'm a different person from when I was obviously a child, a teen, pre-married, after married, pre-kids, post-kids. Every book does something differently and means something different to me. That a book that I had was maybe in my favorites 20 years ago might not be my current favorite, but it's still nested under favorites. But
No, I completely understand what you're saying because I think that's true. But I just am so, I don't know, I'm dumbfounded by this word favorite. Like, I have to have a single one, and maybe that's not what that means. But that really seems like what he was asking.
Right, because if somebody says, Liz, what's your favorite book? I mean, what is your favorite book? Like, how do you answer that question?
Don't ask me.
We must know. I don't know.
And I think, like, part of me wanted to say, like in that moment, that was just like, what's your favorite book? I wanted to be like, The Raven Boys is my favorite book. But then as soon as those words are out of my mouth, I'm like, wait a second. Does that mean, like, Harry Potter isn't my favorite book?
Right.
Does that mean, like, all of these other titles start coming to mind, and I'm like, oh no. And then my mind is a computer on overload.
I feel like if somebody says, what is your favorite book? And you tell them Harry Potter. Let's say you tell them Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Then are they judging you, thinking you never read anything greater than Harry Potter? Do you never read anything more adult than Harry Potter? Are you stuck in this world of, like, children's books? And do you only like magic and fantasy? I feel like there's so much that comes from this one answer. Like, I don't want to be judged for this one answer that I give.
But I think you would be.
Yes.
Like, if I asked an adult person in, like, a literary role, like working at a bookstore or a librarian or someone who seems to know a lot about books, and they told me their favorite book was Harry Potter, even though Harry Potter is one of my favorite books, in my mind I'd be like, huh. I think I would judge them a little bit. And so it's really interesting, because I feel like people expect you, like, if you say that you're a reader, or you say that, or like you work at a bookstore or whatever it is, they expect you to have, like, this wonderful classic or this really dense modern read as your favorite book.
Yes.
And I don't even think there's a book like that in my favorites list, however long that may be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It definitely is a hard question. I think how it should be asked are maybe, what are some of your favorites? Or get a little bit more specific. Like, what are some of your favorites that you've read? Historical, be more genre specific.
Right.
Because I can give you a better answer if we break it down a little bit. But just one favorite, I can't do that. There's too much writing on that.
I know. I really don't want to be judged for whatever single book I choose. Well, and it makes me wonder why. Like for this man in the bookstore today, did he ask me, what's your favorite book, because he was really just looking for a book recommendation? Like, oh, here's this person who probably reads a lot of books. I wonder what they've read recently, because I'm looking for a good book. And I think that's possible. That's where that question is coming from, because otherwise, why would they care?
Maybe, but it's also very hard for me to, if somebody just randomly comes up to me and says, what's a good book? I need to read a new book. Again, I'm like, I don't know you. I don't know anything about you. Like, I don't know. Do you like fantasy? Do you like true stories, autobiographies? Do you hate thrillers? I mean, I can't just say, here, read Outlander. You're gonna love it. Especially if you don't like reading long, deep books isn't your thing, or you don't like the historical time travel. You can't just say, recommend me a book. I need more info.
Right, because then that person could come back to you and say, like, the second most horrible thing, which is, I didn't like your favorite book.
Right.
Which is, like, that's always hard to hear. I feel very defensive for my favorite books.
Yes.
And it's interesting listening, like, usually, like, it's overhearing a conversation and someone will be like they'll pick up, like, The Raven Boys. And they'll be like, did you read this? And they're talking to their friend. And their friend is like, oh, I read it. It was terrible.
And you
like,
want to stand up and be like, excuse me.
Like, that's like one of the best books I've ever read in my whole life.
When you were reading it? That's how I felt when I was at my literary society. The girl sitting next to me, she said, I was talking about The Nightingale. She goes, oh, The Nightingale, I hated that book. And I was like, how do you hate? Okay, hate is a strong word. How did you hate The Nightingale? Like,
right.
And it's almost one of those things where I wanted to, like, get up and sit somewhere else.
We can't be friends anymore because, well, and one of my really good friends who also loves to read, she and I read a lot of books. We read things simultaneously so we can talk about them. Like, we geek out a lot because we read a lot of the same titles. Once in a while, we'll read a book and I'll be like, this was the best book ever. And she'll be like, this was awful. And I'm like, how was it awful? And then it makes me question, like, was I not reading critically enough? Was I, like, glossing over things? Because we both tend to be pretty...
taste?
Right. And I think all of those things falls back on maybe why we don't want to choose a favorite. But maybe choosing a favorite is like having a favorite... I was trying to think of something, but it's like a favorite anything.
Yeah,
like I don't think I have a favorite food.
Yeah, or who's your favorite child?
Right.
It's like you can't really pick, but I guess whatever one is whining the least at the time would be my current favorite, but that rotates. Even that rotates.
Ooh, so, and I think that makes me think of whatever book I'm reading right now is my favorite.
Right, because that's the one that you're invested in at the time.
Right.
Did we answer
it? Is that the answer?
But it can't be, because then you are nullifying all the previous books that you loved.
Right. And see, and that doesn't work either. But I think that I'm looking, I have a stack over here of books that I've just finished reading, and I'm like, I don't know, like 2 books I just finished. Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas was the last book in this series. And then King of Scars was the first book in its own standalone series, but there were 2 series before it that have like some crossover characters. And both of these books, I was so invested in the story. And I'm like, they're both kind of favorites at the moment because of the way they've like further developed this story that I love. And so, I don't know. It's just, it is unanswerable. And I think it's rude when people ask.
You know what? It's funny because, and we mentioned this briefly in the last episode, because one of my favorites, it's probably not my favorite now, but it's on my favorite list because for a time, I mean,
right.
For a time, if you're listening on our podcast, I'm holding up Twilight from Stephanie Meyer. And for a time, a while ago, when these books were coming out, I couldn't read them fast enough. I think I plowed through Twilight in maybe 2 days, and each book after that maybe 2 days. And so at that moment, those were my favorites. But if you ask me today, I wouldn't list that as my current favorite, but it's definitely on the list. And then, so if I told you this was one of my favorites, you would think, oh, Twilight, so she likes vampire books. No, in fact, I didn't want to read it because I don't like anything having to do with vampires.
Right.
Nothing. I'm not a Walking Dead fan. I don't know if that's vampires or zombies or both or whatever.
I think it's zombies.
None of that interests me.
Right.
And so for that to be one of my favorites, people might think, oh, so maybe you've read Anne Rice, Interview with a Vampire. No, I haven't.
Or maybe you haven't read a book in the last 12 years, and so that's your favorite.
Right. But then, like, I'll say this is one of my favorites. This is A Long Way Gone, and this is by Ishmael Bea, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier. And this is an extremely heavy book to get through. It's about a young boy in Sierra Leone and how he has to, or he's in this army of children. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, oh, a long time ago this happened. But no, he's the same age as I am now. So while I was growing up playing with my Barbies, safe in my room, happy in my family, free in our country, this boy was walking around having to assist in destroying villages and, you know, doing unspeakable things that a child should never have to do. And so if you put these two together, they don't make sense.
Right.
Twilight and A Long Way Gone.
But I think that mix is what makes for an exciting reading life, even if it's hard to explain when someone asks for just one title.
Right.
Because there have been a lot of things I've read that were heavy books or were really scholarly books. I read a lot of psychology books for a period of time. Everything I read was like nonfiction about how the brain works because I was fascinated by it. But now I wouldn't call that a favorite necessarily. Right. But for a period of time it was, because I was so interested in the topic.
And you mentioned this before. Is there a difference between a book being your favorite and a book sticking with you for a particular reason? Not necessarily that it was classified as a favorite, but there's something about it that you remember or something you took away from it that's really stuck with you. Do you have any of those? Yeah,
and that makes me think of two different books. Or three different books. Now they're just coming to me. When I was a kid, I read The Giver.
Okay.
And I had never read a book like with an untrustworthy narrator.
I've not read that.
It's really good. It's a children's book. It's a chapter book. And when I read it, like, it changed the way that I thought about things, because I had never read a book where, like, the narrator didn't have all the answers from the beginning.
Oh, okay.
Like, the narrator was just as much in the dark as you were as the reader.
Oh, okay.
And it was fascinating. And I wouldn't have put it on a favorites list when I read it, and I wouldn't put it on a favorites list now. But for those who are listening who have read it, like, that scene with the apple changed the way I read books, because I was in so much shock. And I won't give anything away because you haven't read it yet.
Now
and
I want to read it.
I know, you need to read it, because it really, like, it changed the way that I kind of thought about books. And then I remember, like, in middle school, I read Go Ask Alice, which I was so disappointed in college to find out was not written by anyone named Alice. Was written like as a after school special kind of book. But I was like, that whole concept of that book completely blew my mind. Not that I would have ever tried drugs, but after reading that book, I was paranoid. And then even more recently, I read Wink Poppy Midnight, which is a YA book, and I don't even know how to explain it except for, again, unreliable narrator. I wouldn't describe it as a favorite, but it sticks in my mind.
Yeah.
Which sometimes just means it was a good book, or it just made you think a little bit differently, which I love. I love to read a book that makes me just think about things.
Right.
A little differently.
Yeah.
So do you have books like that?
I do. There's a couple of them that it's funny that you mentioned the one about drugs, because I have one that it's from Sweet Valley High, and I read every single book in the series. I wouldn't consider them a favorite, although back then it was my favorite because I read every single one of them. But this particular book, I believe it was called Regina's Legacy. And I just remember I probably read it when I was maybe 12 or so. And this girl was a very sweet girl. She never did anything wrong. And if I'm remembering correctly, she went to a party and she tried drugs. I don't remember what it was, but it was her very first time. She just tried it because everybody was or offered her. I can't remember. And she died. I think
wow.
she went into cardiac arrest or something because she had a weak heart. And I remember reading that. And out of all the Sweet Valley High books that I've read, and there was like 100, that one is the only one that I can remember the title and somewhat of the story. Because after I read that, I thought, I will never do that. What if I have a weak heart? Not that I had ever been in a position to try drugs or I thought I would be, but I was terrified and it stuck with me. And yeah, it's just funny as an adult. I keep thinking of that. I'm like, Regina's legacy lives on in my mind.
But it's interesting how those books, like they kind of become a part of you in a way. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're reading them at like a critical part when you're a child.
Yes.
I mean, that makes me understand more when parents come in and they're like, I'm not going to let my child read that because kids remember those things. You read a book that's really jarring and you're going to think about it for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and that's what I love so much about reading too, is because that fictional story of this fictional character has stayed with me my whole life. Where in school when we would have the Say No to Drugs campaign and all that stuff, it's like, yeah, say no to drugs, of course. But that didn't stick with me nearly, because I think it's when you're reading a book, you're invested in the people. You're invested in these characters. You become them sometimes. And when something happens to them, it happens to you. And so you feel that like connection. Or if somebody loses a parent or a friend in a book and your like heart is breaking along with the character. And I think that's why sometimes reading can be so much more than just a hobby, but just these learning experiences, because you're walking in somebody else's shoes for 400 pages.
Right. And that kind of reminds me of like becoming invested in a story or invested in a character. I think that is what leads us to finding favorite books and favorite series. But it reminds me of a book that I read again when I was a kid, and it was called The Story Girl, and it's by Ella Montgomery.
I know
you're laughing because I told you this. I've never finished it. And I was so, like, I still think about it now.
But you loved it.
I loved it. In fact, I read it numerous times as a kid.
And I never read the last chapter.
Never read the last chapter.
That is
because
amazing.
I didn't want it to end. It couldn't end in my mind. So that, I don't know, does that make that book my ultimate favorite? Because I've never been able to find out how the story ends.
Do you think you ever will?
No, because now I'm afraid as an adult. Like, the book, it's not like Anne of Green Gables that everyone has read. Like, this is a really obscure book of Ella Montgomery's. It's not in print anymore. And it makes me think that it's maybe not that great of a book. I mean, not that books aren't in print because they aren't great books, but like now I'd be terrified to read it because it would like destroy this like magical idea of it that I have in my mind.
That's a good point. So I was thinking that I have a book that was one of my past favorites, and I guess if you were to say a guilty pleasure read or something, this would probably be mine. But it's Legend by Jude Deveraux. So it's historical romance, kind of a fiction, time travel type book. And I remember I read it probably when I was about 16. And I read it in just a couple days. And I think I just thought it was so fascinating that this girl steps back in time to this other world, and she meets somebody there and kind of has to decide if she wants to go back and forth to her world and her time. And I remember being so fascinated with this book, and I thought it was the most amazing thing I had ever read. And I read it back then. So fast forward 10 years later, somebody's asking me, what's a great book? And I always said, Legend by Jude Deveraux. Legend, Legend. And then I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, but was that a favorite because I was 16? And now people think that that I think that that's the best book ever? And so my question is, do I read it now and destroy the memory of it being a favorite and so fun for me, or do I just leave it alone?
I don't know. I think if it were me, I wouldn't reread it.
Yeah.
Because I would be worried that I'm such a different person now that it wouldn't hold up. And I love thinking about books that I've super enjoyed.
Yeah.
Like I love thinking about them. Yeah. And I feel like if you read it and it wasn't that great, because sometimes even if you've just read a book, reading it the second time, it isn't as good. But I would be worried that then those fond memories that I had of that book would be gone.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely... You know what's funny, though, about that is maybe in the back of my mind, I know I wouldn't enjoy it. Because like Harry Potter, I'll reread that in a hot second. You know?
Yeah.
The Secret Garden.
Oh, love.
One of my favorites. This book this has to be one of my favorites, and it's also a book that sticks with me because this book made me play outside differently.
How interesting.
Every time I went outside, I would pretend that I had to find the entrance to the secret garden. And most days I couldn't find it. And it was this big, huge story in my head. And then when we would be at the grocery store or at the mall, and my mom doesn't know this, so she's probably going to be like, what are you talking about? I would pretend that I was gathering clues. Like people were like telling me clues, and that kind of makes me sound a little crazy, but then I would
I don't think it does.
take these clues. I'm like, oh, I saw potatoes in the grocery store, and that's a clue, meaning I have to look in, I don't know, somebody's garden or something. I don't know. I don't remember. But then I would go home and I would even like step wherever I was going. I would step really lightly and peer around things. And yeah, all because of this book. I was her and I was looking for the secret garden everywhere.
I love it. And I think kids do that. I hope kids do that because I remember having a very Harriet the Spy-esque notebook that I carried around and wrote things about my neighbors in. So
I did too, and I took pictures of them. I did. It was the kind of camera that you hold like this, and then you snap a picture.
I had one of those too. Yeah, you wound it.
And so I would get these pictures developed, and my mom would be like, "What is this that you're wasting your film on?" And I'm like, "They were leaving the house at like 4 p.m, and I'd never seen the person they were with, you know." Oh, I was totally Harriet the Spy.
Right? And it's kind of funny because like now that we're talking about that, I remember how much I loved that book. But if we hadn't been talking about that, I wouldn't have even thought about it being a favorite from when I was a kid. And so, but if we're talking about favorites from when I was a kid,
Aww.
Anne of Green Gables, is, it's one of those books that I think it changed me. Like, so for you, The Secret Garden, like, changed how you played. For me, Anne of Green Gables changed, like, the kind of person I wanted to be. Like, I wanted to be like Anne, and I think I was already probably pretty precocious, so I was probably already borderline Anne anyway. But, like, just the way she thought about things and how she made things better by telling herself fun stories, and
she was
and
kind
I'm
of
like,
awkward and
which
kind
is
of a
so
social
relatable when you're a kid.
Almost. Yeah,
she didn't, well, because she was an orphan, and then there's a lot of reasons, but she had the red hair, and she was just quite precocious.
Yeah, and I can see how reading that as a child, you relate to her so much. But if I read it now as a parent, my heart would be more towards thinking of her as a child and not so much as myself anymore.
Right.
It's such a weird transition.
It is. It definitely is. And I think that oftentimes when I'm reading a children's book, especially when I was a children's librarian, I tried to read a lot of children's chapter books so that I could talk about them with kids and be able to recommend them. And a lot of times I'd read them and I'm like, this book is terrible. Like, what is the moral of this story? And I think it's because it's hard as an adult to even see those things.
Right, for sure. I think if I have to say one of my favorites, and I think you would agree, we have to put a book about reading on our favorites list. And there's many, many to choose from that I've read. I think one of my favorites is Jim Trelease, The Read Aloud Handbook. Because this one, as I was reading it, and I read it, wow. And we're done. I read it cover to cover, and it changed how I felt about reading, I think the importance of reading, and especially the importance of helping my children love to read. And so for that, I feel grateful to this book. This one, is it Mem Fox?
Yes.
Is that her name? She has another book. I can't remember the title of it. And Sarah Mackenzie has The Read Aloud Family. Anne Bogle has I'd Rather Be Reading. All of these books, Honey for a Child's Heart. Mm-hmm. All of those books about reading and the importance of reading are in my favorites. But again, like, if I say what are my top favorites, top 10, do I put 5 books on reading in my top 10?
Right. It's impossible. I mean, we've identified it as the unanswerable question for a reason, because I don't think you can answer it. Because again, do you include books that were your favorite as a child? Mm-hmm. Do you include books that, like, can a whole series be counted as one? Because I love Harry Potter, but even when people ask me, what's your favorite Harry Potter book? I'm like, what? Wait, say that again? Like, because I love the story, and the story happens to take place over many volumes.
Right.
And I don't know. I just get so overwhelmed by the question, and maybe I'm overthinking it.
I was thinking that maybe we're overthinking it, but I feel like if you are a reader, then that's going, like a voracious reader, that's going to be a challenging question. So maybe what we need to do is have an answer ready for that question, instead of like how you were just kind of staring at the person. Like, how dare you ask me that?
Well, and normally, because I worked at the library so long, and I don't think it's an unusual question, it's just a difficult one.
Right.
I think I would normally have just responded, oh, I like to read, because I'm assuming that they're looking for a book recommendation.
Right.
I mean, that's just the assumption I'm making in my mind. I like to read a lot of YA fantasy. What do you like to read?
Yeah.
Because then if they say, oh, I really like to read, I don't even know, adult mysteries, then I can think about, okay, what adult mysteries have I read that I really liked? And then make a recommendation that's both easier for me to decide on and is a book that they might actually be interested in reading.
Mm-hmm. I feel like if you said that to me, and as much as I try not to judge, your brain goes straight to a judgment. And if you said to me, I read a lot of YA, I'd be like, okay, all right, thanks. Because
Right.
in my mind, I'm thinking she will know nothing about the historical fiction or memoirs that I love to read, even though you do.
Right.
But I'm not going to
actually
stick around to ask that because I'm just thinking, okay, that's totally not what I'm asking for. All right, well, I'll just go over here and look.
So maybe the moral of the story of the unanswerable question is we need to learn to not judge others.
Yeah.
Others' reading choices.
Right.
Today there was a mom and a daughter in the bookstore, and they were both looking at books, and they kept holding books up, and they're like, have you read this? Have you read this? And the daughter holds up Alex and Eliza, which is this cute YA romance about Alexander Hamilton. And she holds that up and she's like, have you read this? And I was like, I have read it. And so I told her a little bit about it. And then like back to back, her mom holds up Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. And she's like, have you read this? And I mean, I haven't read it in its entirety, but we read a lot of it when I was in college. And I was like, yeah, I've read that. And so we had a conversation about that too. And she kind of laughed because she's like, you've read a very wide variety of books. And I'm thinking, I think that's probably true of most people.
That's the way it should be. I
Yeah.
think we have our favorite genres and our comfortable spot, but it's so great to know that we've had such a variety of reads. I think that makes, to me, I feel like you can really talk to a person, a stranger, somebody you just met, if you just say, what are you reading? And what did you just finish? And they can tell you. And even
Right.
if you didn't read that book, maybe you've read a book in that genre or similar to it. And if you just talk about books, you can find your next best friend. I know that's a happy ever after thing, but I'm like, books make us all best friends.
Right? It's true. There's, I have a tote bag, and on it says, if I see you reading my favorite book, there it is again, my favorite book, out in public, that's an open invitation for me to come talk to you. And it's true. Like, if I see someone sitting somewhere and they're reading a book that I love, I'm going to say something to them. And I'm not a talk to strangers kind of person.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be like, oh, I love that book that you're reading right now. And I think that all of these things that we've been talking about are ways to be more bookish, talk to people about books, read books that are outside of your comfort zone.
Absolutely.
Have a bigger variety. Like, I'm even looking at the books that I pulled out. Like, this is one of the books I pulled out as one of my favorites. It's a picture book.
What is that called? Guess Again?
Guess Again. It's by Matt Barnett, and it's illustrated by Adam Rex, and they are a hilarious team. Every book they write just, like, knocks it out of the park. This book is hilarious. Now, if an adult asked me, if anybody asked me, what's your favorite book?
You pull out a picture
I'm
book.
not going to say this, but if you ask me, what's your favorite book to go read to a first grade class? This is it. Like, this is my favorite book.
That's your go-to.
That is my go-to because it's hilarious.
That's awesome. Well, for our listeners, if you have a favorite, or if that is a hard question for you to answer, we would love to hear your input on that. And we would also love to hear what a handful of your favorites are. And of course, we know that they are not all-encompassing. And if you list 3, we will not think that those are your only 3 favorites. But we would love to know what they are, because maybe we will add them to our own to-be-read list.
Yay! I love adding to my TBR.
Absolutely.
My favorite thing.
But we thank you for listening in, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed hanging out with us.
Don't forget to check us out on social media and subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss out on any of the fun.
See you next week.